Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest is Dr. David Dean Brockman. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois Medical School, Department of Psychiatry. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Brockman.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And I'd like to talk about your second book, or we had to talk about your new book.
Yes. The title is A Psychoanalytic Exploration of Dante's Divine Comedy.
How were you inspired to write this book?
I was inspired as far back as childhood when my mother was interested in poetry. And in the South Carolina, there were a number of poets, Robert Frost, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Edgar Guest, Joyce Kilmer, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Amy Lowell, Sidney Lanier, Edith Wharton, and so forth. There were a number of other people, but those were the major ones. And as I listened to my mother and her reciting, reading the poet's work, it was intriguing to me.
But you came across Dante's Inferno. I'm sorry. No, Dante's Divine Comedy.
Yes.
It was not. Was it? Have you read this before, or when did you?
No, I did not have the opportunity to study and read any of Dante, like many people do when they go to college or even in high school.
Yeah, I remember being assigned to read Divine Comedy as well. I read that in college.
But
you came across this. You say you went to a speech, a lecture.
Yes, it was a lecture by at that time Father Robert Barron, who was a famous teacher and professor in theology at Mundelein as well as other places. He's now currently an archbishop in Los Angeles and working with the film industry because he has published a journey through different parts of the world featuring the churches and the doctrine, a theological doctrine.
And the influence of those areas, right?
And that was an influence to me. There are other sources. Another one was a colleague of mine, Jerry Kafka, who is now deceased, wrote a paper about Dante's writings. Mm-hmm. And the first line in the poem is, in the middle of my years, I have lost my way in a dark wood, a silva oscura in Italian.
Right. Uh-huh.
And in the middle of my years puts him at 35, which is the classical definition of
middle age. That's correct. Yes.
Middle age and lifespan, 72 years. Anyway, it's a way of describing how he felt, and he had gone through a lot of different difficulties. He lost his mother at 5 and his father at 17 or 18, and was thrown out of Florence by Pope Boniface VIII and the officials, government officials in Florence. And so he suffered multiple losses, emotionally disturbing and traumatic experiences. And he had to wander about the countryside for many years and finally ended up in Ravenna under the support and carriage of a duke there, Duke Polenta, by the way.
And I think that, did you have any help with the research of these locations? Was this really a society, the Dante Society, that helped you study the locations?
No, I have not received any outside help in my studies. I have made several different presentations at the Institute for Psychoanalysis, in Chicago. But those presentations led to some encouragement and some support, emotional support for my project. But it was primarily self-induced and self-sustained. And so...
How did you go about doing your research for this book?
Well, I first had to read the poem.
Yes.
And so I bought a copy. Dorothy Sayers, the famous mystery novelist and who had belonged to what was called the Oxford group, and a group of very famous writers, Green and a number of other writers. But anyway, the initial translation led me to seek other ones because none of them were perfect, and there was always something new or different with each translation.
That's true. So you have to compare translations?
I have about 11 different translations.
Right. And that must
the other major one was one by Singleton at Princeton, and he did the most extensive study, word by word and line by line. But the more modern ones by Hollander, Gene and Robert Hollander, also at Princeton, probably is the best translation to date. Another new one is by Anthony Esselin,
yes,
who happens to be a Catholic. And anyway, it was a journey inside of me to learn more and more and more. And my eagerness to acquire that knowledge and information then informed me that this poem sounds so much like what it happens to people in a treatment, a psychoanalytic treatment.
I see.
And that had already been said by my friend Jerry Kafka when talking about a midlife crisis.
Right.
But it was more my own curiosity and my own drive to expand on that thesis, not only in terms of this initial statement of his midlife crisis, but also throughout the poem. And then I decided that the earlier writings needed to be addressed to see if there was any evidence of his mourning the losses that he had suffered. And the reason that I picked that up was because I had been a member of a research group at the Institute for Psychoanalysis on parent loss and the result, the residua of losing a parent in childhood.
Yes.
And what we discovered in that research was that people tend to be fixated at the time of the loss. And
that takes a long period to grieve for this loss.
That is correct. In fact, they do not know how to grieve. A particular patient that I analyzed and is written up in the book about this research that we published by International Universities Press. Anyway, my patient lost his father at 11, and he had many different kinds of behavior that only identified him as an 11-year-old, even at the age of 30. And so my experience with that enlarged and expanded my seeking further data on that topic with him, with Dante. And I did find data that he didn't cry until he lost his best girlfriend, who happened to be Beatrice. and
Yes.
she was the daughter of a banker in Florence, and they met at the age of 9, and that reminds me that he used the letter 3 or the number 3 and multiplications of 3 throughout the poem. He was kind of a numerical numerologist type of thing, and it was that refers to the Trinity,
Yes.
and to many other uses of 3. And he also was talking many times about the squaring the circle, and as an impossible mathematical task, and it has never been done and never will be done. So it is this impossible task was in a way a reference back to the dealing with his loss.
So
and
you found evidence of his dealing with the losses.
that is correct.
His midlife crisis in the Divine Comedy.
That's correct. In the poem, he mentions in the early poems that he wrote, because his early poetry was in the same style as the troubadour poets, the Saint Glenview,
the traveling musicians, and they sing ballads.
Yes,
too.
from
Right.
southern France and England, and that was the original, the early poetry. And he also wrote some early things on government, and
Yes.
that was called Monarchia.
How did you see the difference between the earlier poetry and this one?
The earlier poetry was, as I say, founded on the troubadour style,
Yes.
and it was an exploitation of women. Not it was a love relationship, but it was in a selfish mode for what the man was doing. He was the ironclad soldier riding a horse and running
Yes.
through the jousting and sword play, and then coming back into the castle, and
the troubadours have to entertain their hosts, right? Who are often the lords and knights, and so
Yes.
the audience will only pay for what songs they want to hear.
That's correct. This selfish love, and he made certain intellectual and emotional moves toward the more perfect, selfless love, but it didn't work. It didn't stay. It didn't. He couldn't sustain that attitude. And then he worked on another a book on it was called De Eloquentia Vulgare. It was about language. He wrote the first book on semiotics and linguistics.
And in the Divine Comedy?
No, before the comedy.
Yes, but what do you see in the Divine Comedy? How was it different? Does he reach this more perfect love?
Well, it's an unfinished book, but he is attempting to select the best type of language in Italy to use in his writings. And he was searching for the best dialect, and he chose the Tuscan dialect, which is the most felicitous and sound-bearing, pleasant sound-bearing dialect. And he also wrote another book on unfinished book on government, and he was making the claim that, like Caesar Augustus, that would be the ideal standard, who was good toward everybody. Supposedly, we know better now that he was not so perfect. These early works
Yes.
have to do with his efforts to put down on paper what he was concerned about.
Yes.
And these early writings were unfinished.
Yes.
And so I went back to look at the early writings to see what I could find that would relate to my thesis that he was suffering from these early childhood losses.
I see.
And so I did
But
find...
this is about a mid-age crisis
Yeah.
having to do with
Yeah.
their earlier
Well,
losses.
What I found was that he was searching for the strong, powerful leader of the of people, that he thought Augustus was the most ideal type. That did not prove out to be correct, but he gave up on that topic as he was struggling, continued to struggle with his inner life. And
That inner life, you say that continual struggle, is to find a powerful leader. Is that a male leader or a female leader? Because you mentioned that he lost his mother at 6.
well, there were not many female political powers.
But the topic of what he's searching for.
Well, he was looking for the strong father to protect him in his own development, you see.
I see.
But that's a childish wish, not an adult and grown-up, psychologically speaking, need. So he was searching for something, and he finally then started writing the poem, and then the poem he was making it much more clear that he was making that struggle.
I see.
And in fact, he invented some new words. One word is modern, he invented, and also he invented transhumanization, which he means by the transforming experiences that people have. And so he did mourn the loss of his girlfriend, it was probably a love relationship at some distance because there was no physical contact. So he dealt with his losses through this new loss of a love relationship, a muse. The poets also often use a muse to inspire them to write. And,
That's true. And did you see that in your book?
Yes, I note those factors in his own personality development, and I claim that he is achieving the same kind of success that we can achieve with patients in psychoanalysis today. And
what kind of intervention would that be?
Well, the intervention has to do with the reactivation of the mourning process. And for example, in the patient that I wrote up in the book that we published on parent loss, that he was able to mourn my separations from him through weekends or holidays or vacations. He would mourn the interruption of our relationship, and that was the in effigy type of a kind of psychological experience of losing me. But in the poem, Dante wept bitterly, lost weight, pounded around in the room where he was living, and suffered tremendous sense of loss and depression.
What was his solution?
His solution was seeking a transformation through his love of Christ and his achieving some relief through his changing his personal attitudes toward women. And
that helped him grieve for the
that
loss of
helped
a
him
parent.
to grieve, correct.
Yes. And so how would you say we can use that?
How
Because
we
you-
as persons
Right,
today,
because you say that
well-
this is solution could be very valuable for treatment of patients right now.
well, he continued to play out his feelings on Beatrice, and there were other female figures in the poem who were like mother figures, and also as well as father figures, which reminded me of how patients develop a father or mother transference. They transfer their feelings
Right.
about their parents onto the training, the treating psychoanalyst.
And that's part of the recovery.
As
right?
part of the recovery is working through those feelings and those memories and the loss and the absence of his parents throughout most of his life. He had to prematurely take charge of his younger siblings in Florence.
And Dr. Brockman, you're also a training analyst, right, for the
Yes.
Chicago Institute of Psychoanalysis in Chicago.
Yes, ma'am.
So have you applied some of what you discovered for patients there, or your
Yes.
training?
Yes, it has been helpful to me, not only my own personal analysis, which I had, that helped me, because I lost my father at the age of 18.
I see.
So I had a personal experience, and the analytic work that I did with Dr. Harry B. Lee, and then again with Dr. Teresa Benedict, helped me tremendously, and learning also from that experience, but learning from also my own family
Yes.
and my children, because I learned much more about it when I was married and had children of my own.
That's true. I think that comes back on what
Yes.
you really are missing, right?
Yes.
And do you feel like the amount of time we give to people for grieving has shortened considerably in our recent times? Than
Yes.
Before, people tend to allow people to grieve longer. Do you feel like nowadays we change our attitude about that things have to go faster?
Yes, it is not very helpful. The recommendation that most people say to the grieving person that you'll get over it, but the fact is we'd never ever get over the loss.
Yes.
The losses are so massive and so painful
Life changing.
that they're and the reminders of the losses are never ever healed. It's better dealt with. You cope with it better, but it's not gone.
So, Dr. Brockman, you have another work coming along. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, the new project has to do with the development of in children, babies, of a loving relationship.
Morality?
But I'm claiming that it begins with the mother instilling into the baby the moral values and the standards of living that help us to survive in this world.
So it starts as early as their nursing period.
Yes, it starts at the nursing period and is a growing and more elaborated as time goes by with the child's ability to comprehend and to interact and to build a personality.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brockman, for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk about my book and to have some opportunity to discuss it openly.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.